Good morning. My name is Lauren Ricci, and together with my colleagues in the Environmental Change and Security Program, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this morning's Wilson Center event, Cross-Sectoral Collaboration for Stronger Conservation and Development Outcomes. Today's event is the third and final event in a series on lessons learned and entry points for integrating biodiversity conservation, public health, food security, and governance. We're pleased to partner with USAID to bring you these extremely timely and important discussions, largely informed by the work done over the last 5 years by USAID's Biodiversity Results and Integrated Development Gains Enhanced Project, or BRIDGE. The first event in this series focused on the evidence base for biodiversity, health, and food security linkages and the relevance of this evidence to food security and health programming. In the second event, hosted last week, panelists discussed what thinking and working politically in the development community means and presented case studies from the fisheries sector in West Africa and wildlife trafficking in Southeast Asia. The challenges are varied, the strategies applied are diverse, but a common thread throughout the conversation has been that stronger integration of biodiversity conservation can improve the impact of broader development objectives, like health and nutrition security and political stability and governance. If you missed the live stream of those first two discussions, I encourage you to scroll down to the bottom of the page where you're viewing this webcast, where you'll find links to those two recorded events, and go ahead and bookmark those for later viewing. Before I introduce Tony Pryor, who will be moderating today's session, a few logistical notes. There will be time for Q&A at the end of today's discussion, so please get your questions ready and send them via email to ecsp@wilsoncenter.org. That's E like environment, C like change, S like security, and P like program at wilsoncenter.org. The recording of today's event will be available in the next 24 hours or so by tomorrow morning, and so encourage your colleagues to come back and watch if they weren't able to watch the live stream. And finally, I want to once again thank our partners at DAI, Bridge Chief of Party, Robyn Martino, and Deputy Chief of Party, Jessica Mirabela, for their partnership in collaborating on this series. And now we'll turn to the program. We're so pleased to have Tony Pryor with us today to guide the panel discussion. Tony is the Senior Programming Advisor in the Strategic Planning and Projects Office of USAID's Bureau for Policy, Planning, and Learning, or PPL. He has been actively involved over the last 35 years as both a technical officer in natural resource management and the environment, and as a project development officer in a range of posts with and for USAID. His work has focused on promoting integrated programming, adaptive management, and learning, especially in complex situations. He and one of our other panelists, James Watson, were judges for the Bridge Case Competition on integrated programming of biodiversity and other sectors, a key part of the overall level of effort by Bridge and E3. Tony, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I think there are actually quite a lot of people online, and we're looking forward to both having you listen to this discussion, but more important, also getting your comments and questions. First of all, I would like to say that I have always had problems coming up with the acronym to fit the letter. So India Papa has always gone past me, so I totally feel your pain. The question I have, I think, that's a driver for this whole session is, why do we have a session, the third session, on collaboration? The other two are about sectors, nutrition, health, nutrition, and education. And then the other one was on what I would call nature, wealth, and power. And the question is, what does collaboration have to do with it? And so let me explain sort of why I think we're here and why it drives so much. The problem with the way we work as development professionals is we tend to work from the point of a sector. We tend to be structured around sectors. We tend to have a career that is somewhat sectoral in design. We tend to have objectives, results that are defined by sectors. And so when we say actually things are cross-sectoral, problems cut across topics, the result that really matters is not just defined by one sector. That's well and good to say that, and that's what we said in the last two sessions. But how do we do it? How do we make it real? And that's where collaboration actually comes to mind. Collaboration is not just a question about, let's make sure we talk together, but let's make sure we understand the other person. Let's make sure we understand where they're coming from, what drives them, what are the incentives, disincentives that each of us have. When we did the case competition and helped judge that, one of the things that I think both James and I found was that there was actually a fundamental problem even the winners had, which was defining what success was, because they could not define success out of their own context. They tried to define, they knew what it was, but how you would monitor it, how you would see it, how you would understand we succeeded is actually really hard. So to me, the fundamental challenge we have, which we're going to talk about today, is most development problems require a cross-sectoral response. Most development problems are not easily pigeonholed one way or the other into a specific category of problem, but that raises huge problems on how we actually get our work done, how we organize ourselves within Usaid or within a partner or in the field, and how we actually collaborate between each other when we don't normally deal with each other in that way. So with that, let me now introduce to you both the initial presenter and then our panel. We're very, very, very happy to have as a starting panelist, a presenter, Francesca Gino, who comes from one of my favorite organizations, Harvard Business School. And she is the Tandon Family Professor of Business Administration in the Negotiation, Organizations, and Markets Unit, great name, by the way, of the HBS, and is the author, among other things, of Rebel Talent, Why It Pays to Break the Rules in Work and Life. I think she will be exactly the right person to set off this conversation for us. And then after her presentation, we have three panelists. One will be Josh Goldstein, who is the director of the Bridge Collaborative, which is the group of organizations which provided us this event and interacted with AID over the years. It's a partnership that drives fundamental change in how we think, plan, fund, and work in the environment, human health, and development communities. And prior to joining Nature Conservancy, where he is now, he was assistant professor of ecological economics at Colorado State. Next person I wanted to introduce, we've already mentioned his name a couple of times, is James Watson, who is Senior Foreign Service Officer with Usaid, now as Usaid's Development Diplomat in Residence at Morehouse College in Atlanta. And he has been served overseas in many posts in many regions, and his most recent post overseas was the Usaid Honduras Mission Director from 2012-2017, actually a perfect post to talk about integration issues and how programs link to each other. And last but not least is Lane Pollock, who is a partner in crime with me in PPL, the Policy Bureau, the Office of Learning, Evaluation, and Research. She is the Senior Learning Advisor for that office. And among other things, before that, she was, I'd like to say, the Organizational Learning Advisor, but probably the first person placed by AID to work on collaborating, learning, and adapting in the agency based in Uganda. And a lot of her experience from that post has flavored everything that AID has done since then on that subject. And with that, let me pass it now to Francesca to start the conversation. Francesca?
Thank you, Tony, and thanks to everyone for making the time and listening in, and also to this quite remarkable panel of experts who are going to join in discussions around why collaboration is so important. Now, what I want to do is tell you a little bit about why is it that I think this is such a relevant topic for these conversations, and then talk about why I think it's so difficult to do, despite the fact that at a very high level, we all understand that collaborating across functions, across departments, across units could be beneficial. And I want to start with a story that comes out of context. This is a case study that I spent quite a bit of time analyzing and studying. And it's the Thai cave rescue that goes back now a few months, so it's the summer of 2018, when a group of soccer players, all young, 8 to 12, got lost into a cave system in Thailand. They were trying to just have a fun exploration to celebrate somebody's birthday before their party on a Saturday afternoon. And as they went deeper into the cave, they didn't realize that it started raining almost too early for the monsoon season, but so much so that as they tried to take a turn and head back out, they couldn't. There was too much water, too much dirt into the water, and they couldn't safely get out. And right at the outset, it didn't take too long for somebody to discover that they went missing. And what happened after that was really an amazing story of collaboration. Within days, we had over 1,000 people on site. And this included the government, the Thai Navy SEAL, diving experts that were flying from all sorts of places in the world to try to help, volunteers that were trying to help in any way they could, whether it was to provide food or try to make the information flow a little bit better given all the parties involved. And if you look at this situation from the outset, you might predict, now we all know that it was a success, that everybody got out of the case safely, but at the outset, given that there were all these voices, such, in a sense, chaos, you might expect that this is gonna end up in a disaster. Too many experts at the table wanting their voice to get into the conversation. Too many different people trying to solve the problem, often not speaking even the same language. And yet, we end up with success. Now, what I love about this story is that given that there was really a lot of pressure and a clear cause that was guiding everyone, which was, let's try to find the boys and their coach and bring them out safely. Everyone was committed to reaching that goal and doing so as fast as they could. And those conditions created an environment where people were more open to each other's ideas. It wasn't a situation where you want your ego to win or your ideas to win over those of others, but you really understand that we are in this together, everybody really motivated by the same cause. Now, I love that story because when I look at that collaboration as compared to many other collaborations outside of a situation of crisis, often this idea of realizing that we're in it together to try to solve complex problems is not the mission we're after, or is not as clear to everybody involved. And that brings out sometimes not the best of our human nature. Often when I teach collaboration in my exec ed classes, I pair up students, participants, leaders, and I ask them to do a very simple exercise, which is going in front of one another, sitting down and getting in position. And I show them what I mean is this. I ask them to engage in a 30-second exercise of arm wrestling. So everybody's usually quite confused because they wonder what the heck I'm doing, but then they get into it since it's only 30 seconds. And I'm usually quite careful in picking on participants who seem to have the right size muscles or lack of, so that there is going to be an interesting 30 seconds of fight. And I tell them that their goal is to gain as many points as possible. And the way you get a point is by putting the other person down. Everybody's very familiar with arm wrestling. I also ask for silence so that everyone who's not participating can look at what they're doing. And what I see regularly is exactly the same thing. You start seeing red faces, people pushing really hard on one another. And depending on how I picked, maybe 1 point, 2 points, people being upset. And at the end of the 30 seconds, I go around, and so you hear a lot of, we didn't get any point, I got 1, I got 2. And then I ask people to reflect on what that has to do with collaboration. And there is a really interesting parallel. Often we approach collaboration with this mindset of, I'm gonna leverage my expertise or my power, my status, how big my organization is or my group is, to put the other person down and get the win. And it's interesting that that is not the right mindset. If we come in with a more open mind, like the people who were working hard on the Thai cave rescue did, no matter where they were coming from, we're going to be able to do something much more productive, which is, in the case of the arm wrestling exercise, is doing this for 30 seconds. That requires a totally different approach. That requires an approach that really makes us think about not only what we can contribute, but also what the other side can contribute and how can we work productively together. Now, when I also look at collaborations across organizations, I'm struck by something else. It's definitely something that is recognized as important. In fact, over the years, we keep on hearing about this need to break down silos and work together to solve really complex problems and create more value. And often the solution that we retract to as leaders is just to put more weight onto how important collaboration is. In fact, many organizations decided to add collaboration or collaborative as one of their values. As it turns out, if you look at the data, that doesn't do anything. I'm sad to say. It could be an important first step, but on its own, it doesn't create a culture where all of a sudden people are collaborating effectively. In organization, another one that is quite interesting from my standpoint, in life pre-COVID, there is an architectural solution, if you will. So a lot of walls disappeared. We're gonna make open floor type offices. And I don't mean to offend anyone who went into that directions, but again, that's not enough. In fact, there are studies that shows that often going into that directions of removing walls and making open floor type offices reduces collaboration rather than increasing it. And so what then can help? And to me, what helps is really thinking about collaboration not as a value to impart, but as a skill to develop. Again, we have some really interesting human tendencies that sometimes make us harder for us to work effectively with one another. And so what are some of the skills that we need to think about in order for us to collaborate effectively? And I want to mention a couple that I think are quite important. And I'll do so by introducing another interesting organization that I had the chance to study recently. The organization is a non-for-profit called Braver Angels. Initially they were called Braver Angel, but recently shifted their name to Braver Angels. And what they do is try to create workshops or debate where Republicans and Democrats come together for a day, or at least a few others, through a guided discussion. Interestingly, the organization was created with the observations that a lot of what seems to get in the way of effective collaboration might have solutions that come from the work that has been done in family conflict, where people get really strong in holding on to their belief rather than being open to the work of others. And if you look and analyze what these workshops are all about, it's really about teaching people to come in and be better listeners. So really giving others the space to put their contributions forward, and rather than wanting to dominate the discussion, taking a step back and ask them questions, help them develop their thinking better, in a way that, again, might positions us differently as we start the collaboration. They also teach people to talk differently. Whenever we're in conversations where people have different views or they might disagree with one another, we need to be better able to show receptiveness. That's how my colleagues and I call this feature. Use language that really thank people for bringing their views forward, despite the fact that they're very different from ours, and then acknowledge their viewpoint before we start expressing our own argument. And interestingly, when we know that we're going to go into a conversation with other people who sit in different factions, different parts of the organization, and we know that they're going to disagree with us, we almost always get on the defensive. And receptiveness instead is all about going in with the willingness to listen and then present our own arguments in a way that is really respectful rather than starting from a point of defensiveness. When we do that, as research that my colleagues and I have done, and as also the success that these workshops, the Braver Angels runs, have demonstrated, we end up being much more productive in our conversation, resolve conflicts much more quickly, and have more productive collaborations. So listening and receptiveness are definitely skills that I think we can all think about more carefully. And then there is another one, which I think in a context like this one could be really interesting to think through, and is the idea of being bilingual. And here's what I mean by this. And again, I'm going to give you a story and then draw out, hopefully, the insight. Another story that I had the chance to investigate, study, and analyze in the last year or so is a story about a man called Bill Riddick. Bill Riddick, who's still alive, did something really interesting in his life, which was running charrettes. These were processes that brought together people who were not seeing eye to eye. He did that a lot in urban planning, but in 1971, he was called upon to run a charrette in a different context. And it was a context where the divide was between a group of people led by a KKK leader locally in Durham, in North Carolina, and on the other side, a group of families led by a Black activist. And what they were fighting over was the decision of whether to go for school integration, since Black and white kids used to go to different schools, but then the school where Black children went ended up being destroyed by fire. And so now there was an opportunity to think about school integration, but one group wanted it and the other didn't. And so Bill Riddick showed up, and for 10 days, he organized this process that gave opportunity to the two groups led by these two individuals to start having conversations about their differences, about their different viewpoints. And what is beautiful about this story is that as the charrette process went on, the two heads of the two sides started discovering that despite their remarkable differences, again, we're talking about a KK leader and a Black activist, they had something in common. In fact, they have a few things in common. They were both parents. They were both people who cared about their children and their educators. And also they were individual human beings. And as such, again, they had ways to connect that they couldn't have figured out without that charrettes. And what helped Bill have productive conversations that really allowed him to run this charrette productively was to rely on his own experience. He could relate to the Black activist because he himself was Black. He himself grew up on a peanut farm, understanding all the tough conditions and the bias and discriminations towards that group of people. But he also understood the perspective of the KK leader and why is it that he was so set in his beliefs of value as he ended up joining that community because he wanted a group to belong to. And it's relying on his multiple experiences that allowed him to bridge the collaborations between these two individuals. And just to end the story ended with the KK leader tearing up his card for belonging to this club and actually voting for school integration. And the story continued because the two of them then became really best friends to the point that when these CPLs died, the Black activist was the person who read his eulogy at the time of death. And so you really wonder, even in situations like that one, where you have people with really opposite beliefs, Bill Riddick was able to rely on his own experiences and figure out how to use the right language to allow the two to come together, discover one another, and really figure out what was common ground despite their differences. And when I think about how this could be an important insight to think about and develop in all sorts of collaborations, I think that there are lots of opportunities, especially in a context like the one we're talking about here, where people have portfolio of experiences that they carry with themselves. But what we often fail to do is rely on those experiences and try to understand which one might work better that might allow us to collaborate more effectively in this context. Or you might be leading at collaborations where people are not seeing eye to eye, but you know enough of each context to help serve as a bridge, as a connector. And again, there is very good research that suggests that when we're able to do so, rely on our own experiences and help others see through their differences, we end up with much more successful collaborations, and collaborations where a lot of creative ideas are brought forward. So this idea of bridging, or being bilingual, if you will, is a skill that to me is a really important one. And I'll end up with a quick one, which is reminding ourselves of something that we do quite naturally when we're little kids. If you talk to any teacher who is trying to prepare class plans for kids to come together and work on projects, one of the things that these teachers would tell you is that they try to make the activity fun, that they want joy to drive the project. And I'm so struck by how often collaborations across all sorts of contexts do not have that. You ask people to describe their latest collaboration and it's this drag and really a draining experience. And so I think to find moments for laughter, levity, a little bit of fun and joy is quite important in driving collaboration. And as I think about a person who does that well, one of the examples that comes to mind is Coach Steve Kerr of the Warriors. And when he started coaching the team and ended up bringing them to quite a bit of success, he identified some of the values for that collaboration, and one of them was joy. And I think it's important to think about what that could do, not only to create an environment where people feel that they can bring in their best, but also to sustain collaborations over time, because collaborations are often like long-lasting marriages that have different phases, some easy ones, some more difficult ones. And so joy can really help us sail through them more effectively. But it always comes back to understanding our human nature and making sure that we think about collaboration, as I said earlier, as a skill to further develop and strengthen. I'm going to stop here and turn it back to Tony to start us off on a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a great beginning for us on a whole variety of levels. I had three quick, one sort of thought coming out of what you just said about 2 minutes ago, and then two questions for you. The thought, and you might not be interested in this because of course you're from the Boston area, but my experience is just psychically is one of the reasons why the Washington Nationals won is they focused on joy. They focused on collaborating together as a team, not having any one person take the lead. And one of the things that the manager did, which was, I think, fundamental, was to say, I want you to celebrate, I want you to have fun, but I don't want you to do it in front of the other team. I want you to do it in the dugout, so it's about you, it's not about dissing them. And not as much has been talked about that, but you don't see that in modern sports very much, actually. And it's just, I think, goes to what you're talking about. Let me ask you two questions. Question number one, going to your example of the cave rescue. I was very taken by that. And I'm wondering, and we also were talking earlier before the rest of you got on this show, about the implications from COVID and the implications of work. I mean, it's a little bit what James Watson has been working on. How do you do work? What do we go back to? And one of the things I've noticed is actually people are more collaborative. They're more willing to listen. They're more willing to get stuff done. Maybe not everywhere, but compared to a normal back and forth, it's quite noticeable. And so part of me is saying, is that because of the risk? Is that because of coming together because there's a common enemy or a common threat or a common problem? And will that disappear once that common threat or enemy is out of the way? If it's the latter, then how do you make collaboration an ongoing thing? How do you have joy and other things ongoing? And then the second one, which is somewhat related, is I think one of the problems that makes this difficult for all of us is it isn't just a visceral issue. It's we actually intellectually have worldviews that we've been trained in that we don't even know are there. The way a social scientist views a problem, the way an economist would view a problem, the way a forester views a problem. to me, the biggest issue is to get them not to think of themselves as a forester, but as a person trying to grapple with a problem in front of them. And honestly, I think the more educated you are, the harder that is. And so especially given where you're sitting right now, I'd love to have you respond to both of those.
Yeah, so great questions. Let me start with the latter. One of the things that Braver Angel does, which I think is really important, is first of all, frame the entire conversation, the entire workshop as a persuasion-free zone. So they're really trying to instill the mindset of, let's try to see what we can learn from one another. Super simple, but again, not the mindset that we usually have when we come in with our expertise into a collaboration. And rather than ditch the beliefs that people have, they actually initially put them into the front of the conversation. So they say, hey, Francesca, walk me through why is it that informs your political views? Where does that come from? And so you start reflecting on why is it that your beliefs are so set on something? Maybe it's the way you grew up, or maybe it's the type of networks or circles, social circles that you have. But it's really triggering a reflection of making you understand that there is a good reason for why your beliefs might be the way they are, but also an understanding that that might come with bias. And now that we have that conversation, I think it's easier to realize that that's what we carry with ourselves. Now, I have to say that often in organization, when I see conflicts that go on in collaboration, I often see the following. People being expert, butting heads to heads, and starting to believe, well, maybe Tony is actually not as much of an expert as I thought he'd be, or is not as committed to the cause as I am. So we go very easily to that explanation that allows us to say our view, our course of action is better than what you're suggesting. If in that moment we're able to stop ourselves and say, as it turns out, Tony is as much of an expert as I am. As it turns out, is as much committed as I am to this cause. When we're able to do that, then what pops up next is curiosity and willingness to understand your viewpoint. Because at that point, I need to ask, well, if that is the case, why is it that this view is so different from mine? And I'm gonna start seeking an understanding of why is it that you're coming to the table that with a different mindset. Again, it's difficult to do because as human beings, we go to judgment rather quickly. And I often say, which is something that I've learned by taking improv comedy classes, that curiosity and judgment can coexist. So approaching our interaction in difficult collaboration with a mindset of curiosity is super helpful. Now, it requires thoughtfulness. So I think the curiosity is something that this crisis is triggering in people. Partly is because I'm seeing you in your home. So I start wondering, do you live alone? Do you live with others? Do you have people to care for? And so I think that people just approach the interactions with more curiosity. I'm hoping that we can retain that because it can be really helpful as a perspective to have on collaboration even after and outside of crisis. So to me, collaborations can be created successfully or more successfully and can be sustained over time if we think about the fact that we not only need to think about values or climate in the collaboration, we really need to bring it down to the human level of skills.
It also makes sense to me with my mic unmuted. No, that's a very good point. I'm just wondering if you have one last comment in terms of this, the question of how do professional or how do sectoral people work together? Because obviously in Harvard, you have all these various parts of the university, you have colleges, and as we know, colleges are not politics free. I mean, you have all these pressures between them. How does collaboration work between groups of different training, different backgrounds, and belief systems that frankly have taken 10 years to develop or whatever?
Mm-hmm. So the mindset that I think is helpful, which again is a mindset that the situation of crisis in the Thai cave rescue triggered, is one of, I'm conscious of the expertise that I bring, but I also have the humility to recognize that others might have equally valuable things to say. That's hard, because often the more experience and expertise we acquire, the least likely we are to not come to believe that we know it all. And so I always, almost as a habit, try to remind myself that despite the fact that I know a lot or that I'm an expert in my field, there is more for me to learn. It's a really simple shift that is actually quite helpful as I try to approach conversational collaborations with others. Again, it doesn't come naturally, so that's why I'm thinking the reminder. It's also a habit that I actually learned. I didn't come up with it. I learned from a person who I studied quite a bit when it was time to write Rebel Talent, and it's Captain Sally Sullenberger, the pilot who ditched a plane in the Hudson River back on a cold evening in 2009. And the reason why I ended up talking to him is that when I learned about the accident, I did so not because of the movie or the books that he wrote, but because of reading the conversation as it was happening at the time of the accident. It's free data, so if you're interested in decision making as I am, that was quite a good source of information. And what stood out at me as I was reading the conversation is that in a moment where he really didn't have any time, he had 208 seconds to make a decision. That's what was the time he had between when he discovered there was no thrust in the engine and the time he ditched the plane in the Hudson River. Lots of pressure, as you can imagine. Also lots of anxiety. You have 155 passengers on the planes. Rather than going to the most obvious answer, which is what most of us would do, he kept broadening his view, considering all sorts of alternatives rather quickly. And when I talked to him, I discovered that by the time the accident happened, he had all sorts of experience and expertise. Served in the military, had experience flying all sorts of planes, 30,000 hours of flying experience under his belt. He has served as a volunteer to study previous accidents, so lots of information about what it is that can go wrong. But every time he walked into the cockpit, he would ask himself, how is it that today's flight could be different? What do I stand to learn? That is just a beautiful habit that I think allows you to recenter when you enter collaboration. It's not just about my expertise. I'm sure that there is something to learn from others' contributions.
The one final point, and then we'll let you go. The Thailand example, of course, has one area of conflict where there was one person involved, I won't name who it is, but who had a totally different point of view and who got into an antagonistic relationship with somebody else. And in my view, it's sort of the opposite of what you're talking about. It's sort of like, actually, I know better than you. My approach is better. You're putting at risk people. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to listen to you, but then I'm going to ignore you. So I think your example is an interesting one because there's also a counterfactual built into it, which of course turned out to be totally unhelpful.
Yeah, and it's interesting that conflict is part of collaborative projects when you bring experts to try to work together on complex problems. And in a sense, we should welcome challenging views and give them full consideration. That's why I think listening is so important. And in so many meetings, in so many collaborations, if you actually analyze them carefully, there isn't true listening. There is people half listening, but really what they're doing is getting ready to talk and express their views. And so I like the moment of calmness and recentering and say, okay, let me see if I'm actually listening truthfully. And again, I'm not saying this to others. I recognize this on myself. Again, one beautiful aspect of taking improv comedy classes is doing exercises that teach about listening. And I remember one called the last word exercise. So if we're all working together and we need to tell a story, the rule is that if I go after you, Tony, the first word in my sentence needs to be the last word in yours. And I remember having these moments where I realized clearly when others are talking, usually I stop listening halfway through rather than waiting till the end. So we all have instinct and good intention, but I think our human nature sometimes gets in the way of productive collaboration. And so being a little bit more thoughtful about the basic skills that could help us out is, in my mind, key.
Thank you very much, Francesca. I think you set up the conversation for the rest of the hour very well. I really appreciate it. I will now look at improv comedy differently. And thank you again. Have a good day. Thank you.
Bye.
So that was probably the most interesting thing I would have said all day. So what we're going to do now is go panelist by panelist to say, what did you think of Francesca's commentary? How does it relate to your work? How does it resonate with what you do day to day? And what would you add to her comments, especially on, I think, the point about what drives collaboration? So let's first deal with Josh, and we talk a little bit about the Bridge Collaborative, if you wish, the organizations that you're working together with, but also anything else in terms of your professional life or personal life that resonate with what you just heard. Josh?
Great, thanks, Tony. Francesca's comments were a perfect setup to today's conversation. And I mean, the simple answer is that it all resonates really strongly with our experience, both in fostering collaboration at the Nature Conservancy and in my role helping to run the Bridge Collaborative. It's a partnership of the Conservancy with PATH, the International Food Policy Research Institute, and Duke University. And what I love so much about what Francesca has done is she takes all these complex interactions of collaboration and she boils them down to a set of skills and techniques that take away a black box or sort of gut instinct and give us a roadmap to how we can really build these and foster these in organizations. And I actually want to start by appreciating her comment on laughter, levity, and fun, because I think anyone who has been involved in collaboration or run away from it, not wanting to do it, knows that it's hard work. And it's difficult to build those bonds and really work through the difficult challenges. And sometimes I think we think that serious work needs to be serious in how we execute. And I actually think it's laughter, levity, and fun, as she highlighted, that fuels our ability to get through those tough moments and really fosters a desire to understand each other. And I was thinking about some of the most, I think, impactful times we've solved our own problems, with the Bridge Collaborative or projects we're trying to work on to find new ways forward. It's when we're connecting sort of mind and hands together, where we are actively using everything from Play-Doh to pipe cleaners to crayons to whiteboards and so on. And we are actively sort of, mapping out and prototyping what solutions could look like. And I think bringing in that fun and bringing in the really hands-on work can be a really impactful way forward. And, just a couple of reflections then on some of the additional comments you made. Empathy is such a critical starting place for collaboration. And I think, when we enter in, coming from our sectors, we have different terminology, mental models, planning approaches, you name it. The A through Z is different in the health sector than the environment and so on. And it reminds me of the importance of being really curious about what others' perspective is and also finding a way to be really clear in how we speak about things. And her comments made me think of an example we had where we were trying to form a partnership between the environmental and humanitarian sectors. And there was a conversation about short-term versus long-term. And we kept using these terms, short versus long, and it pretty clearly became evident that in the humanitarian sector, that short meant weeks to months. And in the environmental sector, we were talking maybe 1 or 2 years. And so there was this fundamental difference, and we were just not understanding each other and the different sort of mindsets we brought into this collaborative effort. And we realized that if we just step back, and Francesca highlights this in her broader work, and be specific about what we mean, instead of sort of using sort of shorthand terms that are familiar to us but not the other sector, we can really find ways forward. And so when we talk in actual timeframes, okay, we mean what happens in the next couple of weeks versus months, as opposed to a couple of years from now. All of a sudden, you can tunnel through the complexity and really find out what's going on. And I think, again, it all really starts from a place of empathy, and you're really listening to understand what's going on. And I'm going to toss out one more connection to improv that our team has really cultivated. And I think Francesca's last word example is great as well, which is the yes and principle. And that's where you have to really actively listen to what another person has said and build upon it. So you keep a conversation going, which is so important in collaboration, rather than yes, but statements where you're closing the conversation down. And so I think, there's so much from her work that resonates. I think one sort of little ripple I would add to build onto it is, in any collaboration, we're always struggling to, understand, some other sector's perspective, the evidence there, the experience they have. And I think part of a successful collaboration and being humble is really recognizing that not are you just not the expert of everything, but you're not going to be the smartest person in the room on every topic. And how do you really use that empathy, that curiosity, and that listening to understand to drive that understanding and connection of knowledge across the sectors. So really enjoyed her comments, and just a bit to set the stage.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I also really enjoyed them, and I thought that set up this conversation really well. James, let me turn to you. So we have all this discussion about how do you support collaboration, how do you work together? I mean, this issue about yes and I think is a really interesting one. But now let's put it in an institutional context of development agency. You have people with careers that are moving forward over 10, 20 years. They're going to be in a post for a certain period of time, then they move on. How do you promote and support and celebrate collaboration in that context?
Yeah, I think in my experience, particularly in Honduras, that it was about one of the issues that I think Francesca touched on was getting everyone to we, right? Getting everyone to acknowledge that our success was the objective, not project level success, not my individual success, but that if we had and what we worked on in terms of the strategy was producing a results framework, a strategy that we could all buy into. And there was effort involved in that. Getting, we used to talk about how we struggled with people, the results frameworks, you have the boxes that represent ideally a project. And at one point, people didn't see their box. And so how do we get people to acknowledge that their contribution is there? It's in that framework. It's in those results we're pursuing, even if they don't see a box like they used to in maybe past strategies. So that was part of it, to say that even though you're an education officer or an economic growth officer for the direct hires, and the same for our foreign service national colleagues, that even while you're here, you're going to be able to identify results that you had a hand in, and attribute some of your contribution to some of that success, and be acknowledged for it as part of the group. So that was, I think, hopefully answering your question, was how we tried to address the silos and the divisions that are sort of naturally part of our work, by saying, okay, we understand, we still want that expertise, we still want that technical perspective and responsibility, but it needs to be combined with others. It needs, the last point I'll make is and I think this is leading to this, it needs to be, I always value the diversity of voices in decision-making, and I think that's part of some of what Francesca was touching on, that I didn't know where the great idea was gonna come from. And I was okay with that. I sort of, as a director, you can throw your weight around a little bit if you want to. But the way I tried to throw mine around was to say, let's hear from someone we don't expect to hear from. Let's get another perspective involved. Part of that was because I had an ambassador who wanted the development guy at the table when they were talking about security issues, because I just had a different perspective, and he wanted that that diversity of opinion to go into decision making, and so I valued that as well at the mission level. So yes, bureaucratically there were issues and it was a struggle, but I think when we got folks focused on shared objectives, shared results, and some shared ownership of those results, that we were able to move forward on collaboration in a cultural way within the mission.
I think that's thank you, James. I think that's a really interesting point. I think it isn't a question of organograms or institutional structure, but it is also culture, and thinking about any organization as having a series of cultures in them. Lane, let me turn to you. I mean, you basically live and breathe collaboration on most of your days. What did Francesca say that was an aha moment for you that sort of builds on what you're doing or gives a different spin on what you're doing, especially as it relates to the difficulty of taking all these ideas and putting them in the context of working with development professionals in an organization?
Yeah, thanks, Tony, and thanks to Josh and James for your comments as well, because I ditto everything they said in terms of observations and what resonated. I think what particularly resonated and maybe solidified some of the work that I think Usaid has been doing and within the agency, but also with our partners, things that really rang the bell for me, so to speak, were around getting beyond stating collaboration as a value. We want to collaborate. You know, kind of that concept as a leadership position and a leadership vision is really important. But I know in some of Francesca's work, she also talks about that being grossly insufficient and how leadership also needs to play a role in investing in skills, modeling those behaviors. So kind of we work with a lot of folks like James in missions who really want to build that, but we need to kind of deepen that practice. I think a second area that really resonated with me, both in terms of reading Francesca's work and what she said today, was around this balance between skills and practice within the collaborating, learning, and adapting work that our team leads and kind of works throughout the agency to advance. We talk a lot about the practice, but it's also the mindset. And I loved Francesca's examples and description of that around humility, curiosity. We talk about, in our work, we talk about a learning mindset. And that mind shift that's required to really open up, as she said, to actively listen to others. And I think it's that combination of broader culture that James is just talking about as well, within that individual, team, and organizational skills, systems, processes that can all work together to really enhance collaboration. It did, therefore, you know, and we look through the lens of the CLA framework, which talks about how do you collaborate, learn, and adapt within the program, the programming that you do. And I know a lot of folks who are listening and watching today are very familiar with that from the work that they do. But the other side of the framework, and we always use our hands like this because it's the other side, is around culture, processes, and resources, right? So it's about how we invest in that. So for me, I also had an aha moment, again, kind of lifting up an idea that had been out there around making sure that we invest in these skills, the skill development, investing in our partners, being able to spend time and treasure and create, as Josh was describing, those opportunities to really create joy. That is work. That is worth it. And that can further reinforce the collaboration that we're seeking within a partner team, across partners. And then finally, I would add, for me, I think, and this is kind of extrapolating from what Francesca was saying, the role that facilitated or guided conversation could play or does play in our work and how important that is to have as a resource. Some of the examples she was providing, right? There was a role there for someone to be helping to have that conversation, helping folks to have that conversation who might otherwise be coming into it with a much more antagonistic viewpoint. So I think it reinforced for me how important that facilitation skills are to help broker these types of conversations and to help strengthen the types of relationships and partnerships that USA would like to have with its partners, but also partners with each other, and the examples that both Josh and James have spoken to.
Knowing you so well and your work in Uganda makes me realize that this, what you just said is so critical, but most people don't pay for it. So most people don't allocate a level of effort to have that happen. Or if they do it, James, right when you're beginning a strategy. Let's all work together. Okay, that's done, now go and implement. And the implementation could fall back into those boxes, which I think everybody will recognize often happens. So how do you make it intentional and how do you make sure it continues is my next question. Let me ask all of you that. In interacting with your organization, it's important to collaborate, but how do you make it part of the way you do your work? And how do you make sure it's, I mean, to be quite so crass, but how do you finance it? I mean, how do you make sure that it's something that is front and center rather than something saying, here are the 5 things I want you to do, have a nice day, now go ahead with your regular job. Jeff, do you want to start us off on that?
Sure, be glad to. And, I think this is a particularly important moment to be asking this question amidst the pandemic and the economic crisis. Because Tony, I'd agree that oftentimes these positions, come up where people are intentionally meant to be a connector, both within an organization and large organizations like the ones I work in or Usaid and so on, or with external partners. And that is a set of skills and expertise that's really needed and valued and helps grease the wheels for productive collaboration. But I think in economic crises like we are facing now, those can be some of the jobs that are cut first. And I would argue that can be short-sighted. And so maybe to answer your question, I might offer a couple of reflections. The first is more at a leadership level, where I think it's becoming increasingly important that collaboration sometimes makes people think that you are moving out of what your organization's mission is supposed to do and bleeding into others, and that it can be mission creep. I think it's really critical in these moments for people in leadership roles to communicate clearly that this is actually mission critical, that this, to achieve our mission, whether we are coming from the environment or from the health or from one of the development sectors, to achieve our goals, it is critical to foster cross-sector collaboration and that we can achieve much more together. I think that messaging is really important as a foundation. And I think, in addition to sort of supporting key staff positions, and using sort of, baking those into sort of, core funding and other, roles to make sure those positions stay amidst difficult times. I think there's also a role here for, as an organization moves to collaboration, to be setting clear metrics for what success looks like. That those metrics should really codify that cross-sector collaboration is important. So if we are trying to, from an environmental perspective, for example, to reduce deforestation in the Amazon or any other places where it's really active, as an organization, we also have to have clear metrics and outcomes that connect us to the issues on food and nutrition security, on energy and other resources that are part of that larger picture, and be able to really help set that North Star for the organization. And I think, leadership, mission critical, and keeping sort of a clear North Star with metrics are really important things that can help drive things forward in this kind of context, especially amidst the economic crisis, which makes people, I think, want to retreat back to their silos when perhaps we should be doing just the opposite.
Thank you. But before I move to James, excuse me, let me just mention for those of you who are listening to us online, you can actually get into the conversation. We want you to send us some questions that we can have the panelists discuss amongst themselves and with you. The way to do that is to send your comments to ecsp@wilsoncenter.org, ecsp@wilsoncenter.org. Thank you very much for that, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. James, do you want to tackle this question of how do you build this in?
Sure. I would, echoing a lot of what Josh said. It came down to acknowledging for us, in the case of Honduras, that the project success the mission had enjoyed literally for decades, in a country where 60% of the population was living in poverty, the highest homicide rate at the time, poor development statistics across the board, that maybe that wasn't enough. And we had to acknowledge that and accept that and act on it and decide, okay, if it's not enough, what do we need to do to be better at making an impact in Honduras? And going out, there were, I think, 2 trips that I took that sort of had a big impact on me. One was with our Pro Parque project, where I saw, it was a partly a biodiversity program, and we talked to mayors, we talked to farmers, we talked to households where we were reaching their children with nutrition programming, not necessarily through this project, but they were all part of the mix and in some way affected or linked to our efforts to address biodiversity, working with 15,000 coffee farmers, and so protecting water resources, managing the water resource with them, the local government, the private sectors, bigger private sector, and so seeing the different angles of these issues caused me to go back and talk to my colleagues about, well, why aren't we involving? Why don't we have a diversity of opinions and perspectives and skills in discussions about complex development challenges, as opposed to a project approach, which can be complex, but also is again limiting in terms of the types of expertise, the types of experience, the types of contributions you get involved. So we worked hard at actually acknowledging the value of, again, a diversity of perspectives to deal with diverse and complex development issues. And I think I think people bought into that, and people, from my perspective as a director, I'll just make this last point. What I was able to do was to sort of motivate staff and encourage staff to step out of their comfort zone and comment on, you know, if it was a local government expert, our local government person, have them comment on our education program. You know, what do you think about it? What do you know, you might have children in schools here. What's your perspective on a project you're not responsible for? We're not paying you to manage. And that, again, I think evolved where as long as I was comfortable hearing, you know, the front office was comfortable hearing different perspectives, that it helped make it a little bit more acceptable across the organization.
Thank you. Lane, do you want to talk a little bit about this? I was struck just what James was saying right now with the work that you helped start. It was after you had left, but in Uganda, going out to field-based reviews. And the review was about the problem, not about the project. And actually, it took people a long time to say, you mean you're not reviewing my contract? You're not reviewing the 3 things I'm supposed to do? And why are you talking to the beneficiaries or the people in the community rather than talking about whether or not my inputs and outputs fit in with what my contract says? I found it unbelievably fascinating, but somewhat unusual in aid. So I just wanted to ask you, how do you build this intentionality into a corporate system, particularly one that this does not come cost-free? Absolutely.
And there's several missions have done some version of the field-based portfolio review, so I want to give credit where credit is due. And it's often turned into exactly the kind of collaborative trust-building exercise that James was just describing, particularly because of the leadership tone and posture that he was just describing in his own situation, for example. Creating that safe space, as you said, Tony, to have a different type of conversation. This isn't a performance monitoring moment. This is a let's step back and ask each other questions about how we are collectively achieving the greater goal. I think this also gets to a point that Josh was making that I want to really appreciate around understanding this is part of the mission. This is part of the development work we're doing. This is part of the theory of change of our work, is the making sure that we are not having gaps that need to be reconciled, that we're not tripping over each other in our work, that when it makes sense, we are connecting across sectors and together achieving, what is it, a former colleague says 1 + 1 = 3, or maybe 4, types of results, right? And I think one point about the intentionality that you're making, Tony, is we have to be explicit about that up front in our strategies, in our projects and activity designs as we go with our partners. We are part of the change in terms of how we work together, and that's critical. Building trust, another reason I love the field-based portfolio reviews is because they're, as far as I'm concerned, car rides, right, for site visits, getting people from different teams into that car, it's a win, period. Even if they don't have you know, the best trip, you know, to see the perfect partner, just being in the car together for hours at a time, things are going to come up that don't normally come up in an informal setting. And I think that creating those types of moments is really important. Again, building in opportunity and expectation around staff engagement. Another way to look at this question is, what is it that people are collaborating about, right? What's the objective of the collaboration? I think that's also quite important to talk about it. In some cases, it is a very clear shared project outcome. In others, it's getting a better cross-functional understanding. The cross-sectoral work, of course, it's hearing each other's language so that we can achieve that greater result. But I think being quite clear up front, what is that collaboration going to look like? And what are all the different modalities that we can use? If we're doing a portfolio review, how do we do that in a way that builds collaboration? If we are having an information sharing meeting, what is it that we can do to build collaboration? As we engage with local partners, how can we do that in a way that elevates local voices and we can hear more frank feedback to Usaid, which is one of the hardest things to do, in a way that we can actually take that on board and do something about it. My last point would also just be, again, from a staff engagement perspective, people like to learn, generally speaking, right? So putting people together in terms of opportunity to not only work together, but learn from each other, learn new things, learn new language, can be an incentive and a driver in and of itself, and can be another version of that joy that Francesca was talking about and that Josh was building upon earlier. So some more observations, but back to you, Tony.
I think one of the common threads, we're talking about people as being different, about having different mindset, but we're all working on similar problems. We're all working on development issues. We all have a interest and hunger for trying to help work with people and empathy for people. Somehow providing space for that to provide a common ground for discussion rather than formally making it into a meeting space. Now we're going to hear from, Lane, and then she's going to hear from James. I think it changes the dynamic. And your point about the car ride reminds me of Xerox, of course. One of the things that Xerox realized way early on when they were developing the idea of community of practice is people learn in their company over coffee breaks. So they just allowed more time for coffee breaks and tried to provide a little bit of functionality so that people would be stimulated to ask some questions without making it seem too artificial. One of the places that you tend to do this would be during breakfast and also those car rides. So I do think it happens. The problem is what happens after the car ride. How do you break down those barriers once you get back to your order of work? We have about 200 people on the line. We have a couple of questions coming in. So I will be giving them to you in a minute. But James, let me ask you, how do you change the corporate mentality from your office structure to one where you continue to interact with each other over time?
Well, one thing we did was we knew we were going through, this collaborating, doing, cross-sector monitoring trips, et cetera. That was significant change, and getting our partners involved in that as well was a significant change. So we didn't want to compound that by enforcing other structural changes. So we established, as in line with our new strategy, development objective teams, but we didn't change the structure of the mission. We maintained our offices. We still had an education office, an EG office, program office, et cetera. So we didn't add on the added weight and of trying to say, now we're also going to restructure organizationally. And there were challenges with that. It was an overlay. It seemed duplicative at times. But we paid attention to the aspects, to the challenges of working that way, so that it didn't become so onerous that we couldn't actually do the fun work, which people acknowledge was fun. I think Elaine's point about learning, and I've been around long enough to remember when Administrator Natsios, we introduced knowledge for development, KFD under his administration, and never really went anywhere. And so this, and that was an exciting time, but without any payoff. So knowing the work that Lane's been involved in, that you've been involved in, Tony, where learning is value, we're now, I feel like I'm part of a learning organization now, and that's a very different culture to work in. And so promoting that and celebrating that, and like you said, people like to learn, and so giving people opportunities to learn and to grow and to contribute in different ways was one of the ways we addressed, again, the challenge of working differently. Let's make it a little more fun than it might otherwise be.
Thank you very much. Let's take a couple of questions here. We have one from Lawrence Sperling, Department of the Interior. Josh, for you, let me have you start it off. You mentioned the importance of building in metrics to embed the value of collaboration across sectors and disciplines. How do we actually measure it? And how do we measure collaboration? How have some examples of measurement between the environment, natural resources, and other sectors, but how do you even approach doing that?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, and I would say the honest answer is it's still tricky in real time. There's two pieces of measurement that I think resonate in my experience. The first is on the metrics of the sort of outcomes, the changes in the world that you're trying to see around the environment, health, and development. And again, I will emphasize again there the importance of setting up, the challenge or the question that you're trying to answer in an integrated way that has to have those component parts from the different sectors, so people see themselves in it, but also so you can really be honest about the interactions where enhancing one outcome, say for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, may align with or conflict with another goal around food security and so on. And it elevates the conversation to have more honest and sort of trackable discussions. And so I think the other part of the question, I believe, is really around, I think what Lane said before is, does 1 + 1 = 3 or even 4? And if we're less than 2, we're in trouble, right? Then collaboration is actually undermining our effectiveness. Easy to state, not easy to measure. And I think what we need to be doing is thinking about sort of steps along a collaborative process, rather than sort of starting initially with a grand planning session, finding the way forward and the answer, executing it over multiple years, and at the end measuring it. To have to adopt much more of the Silicon Valley and other types of approaches of lean startup and lean impact and similar kinds of things, which are much shorter and faster iterative loops, where you're each day and each week and so on, asking what do we need to learn next? How do we go about learning that as quickly and efficiently as possible? Then how do we take the information and look at that next? And so I think part of the evaluation or the monitoring and evaluation question with collaboration can be sort of reduced and become more bite-sized, to really be focused, as James was saying, as a learning organization. What is the limiting piece of information that we need to learn next? Can we agree on that and go out and actually do it? I think there's still I think that can help us be much more navigable in the way we move. There's still the bigger question about, does 1 + 1 = 3? And I think there are guidance out there and so on that people can reference, but I think I often like to bite size it down to what is a much more operational definition of learning, and how do we know if we're moving in the right direction?
Right. Thank you, Josh. Lane, let me quickly throw it back to you for a quick sort of addition to that, because I think it's also in your wheelhouse. I have a couple more questions here I want to try and fit in too, but
Sure.
do you want to respond, Bill, on that?
I would mostly underscore everything Josh said. I think it being so important to separate out, or not separate out, but to recognize that, again, you're doing collaboration, you're collaborating with a purpose, and being clear about what you think that purpose is and the minimum collaboration required, right, to achieve that purpose. Because we're talking about time, treasure, energy, emotional energy, among other things, and you want to make sure to recognize that those have costs associated. What isn't helpful is for the message to be collaborate for collaboration's sake, and for folks within partner Usaid staff, development actors, etc., not having a sense of, again, what's that purpose. So I agree with Josh in terms of making it more bite-sized to kind of gauge how you're doing in a very iterative and agile way. Of course, definitely agree. I think the more explicit you can be about what role is collaboration playing in that theory of change, again, I actually think you can get a much better handle on how successful are you in doing it, and or how does the nature of that collaboration change as you go. So.
What I'd like to do, there are two questions that have come in. They're different, but they do have a similar relationship in terms of the question of who leads, who is second. As one phrase, it's a power issue between different people at different levels. Let me raise, first of all, the first one from Jonathan Young, who's in Usaid Mozambique as program officer. When it's multi-sectoral, I often see the approach of having co-leads, such as each sector gets their own representative, which often results in implementation that gets back to being stovepipe. This is your program, this is my program, and there's not the link. When you design a multi-sectoral and complex and a collaborative approach, how do you decide who leads it? So that's one question. The other one from Laura Ahern, who's a monitoring learning advisor with Usaid's Learn program. Could the panelists address the issue of power differentials, whether internal to our organization, such as between the front office and other staff members, James had talked a little bit about this in terms of FSNs and FSOs, or between development professionals and the participants or beneficiaries of a program. My example in Uganda, for instance, with the beneficiaries thinking one way and the implementers thinking another way. Should the power differentials be openly acknowledged, or are there other ways to minimize them? Who would like to, James, you want to tackle sort of a cut at this? We don't have that much time, but I wanted to give you guys a chance.
On the first one, I mean, the way we sort of dealt with that in Honduras was we picked, again, we organized teams, development objective teams and multi-sectoral teams, and we picked among our office chiefs to lead the teams. So we had our poverty reduction team was led by our education officer. We had an EG office, we had EG direct hires, but we chose to ask her to lead the team because we wanted a team leader. We didn't need necessarily, not that she wasn't, but we didn't need the poverty reduction expert in that seat. We needed someone who's going to help the team function. And that was how we prioritized how those roles were divvied up. And we worked consistently and met consistently with our team leads to make sure they were still playing that role of bringing, convening, guiding, coaching, but not necessarily putting one portfolio or one set of programs above or in a position of more importance to any other. So that's on the first point. Do you want me to comment on the second or someone else? You're muted, so I.
You want to comment quickly on a second, that's fine, because they are related, but it's up to you.
Yeah, you can go to somebody else. I'll let somebody else.
Josh, do you want to address those?
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo James's really good comments on leadership. I mean, someone does have to lead an effort, and it can be very confusing when you have multiple leaders and it's not clear who gets to decide. And so I think the things, I would add or reiterate too are, I have been part of collaborative efforts where sometimes the mental model coming in is that my sector actually is on top of the hierarchy and others are in service of that. And I think it's coming in with a genuine intention, in a mental model that believes that. And I think that can be a really difficult place to set up leadership and power dynamics. And so while we do need a leader, and I think really critically, we need to be clear on who makes decisions at different points. We need a decider. There needs to be a flattening of the hierarchy amongst the sectors to all come in as equals. And then any one project or any given moment, there may be one sector that is out in front or doing more of the heavy lifting or engaging certain actors more fully. But I think that flattening is really critical to as a mindset to bring into collaboration. So that's what I'd add to this conversation.
Let me go then to, excuse me, one last question, because it sort of ties everything up and it links back to the point of this series. It's from Jenny Kane, who's Biodiversity and Natural Resources Specialist at Usaid E3 office. What do you feel are the particular issues related to collaboration specific to the whole biodiversity, natural resource management realm? In other words, does integration with biodiversity conservation and natural resources management have any distinct considerations related to collaboration? Lane, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, and I'm highly sensitized to the fact that there are lots of biodiversity and conservation specialists listening and sitting right next to me on the screen. So I guess what I would put out there is, and what I know of the sector and how it shows up in comparison to other collaborations that happen, are things like timelines, like Josh was mentioning. My timeline as a health and education specialist could look quite different than your timeline, someone who works in environment conservation in that language. I think, though, an advantage that this world has, this particular area of technical expertise within the development community, is what I know, that the integration of cross-sectoral work, the integration of different lenses, some of the theory of change work that has been led by this sector or this kind of sub area within development has some leading thinkers and practitioners in terms of using tools that bring others in. And I'm thinking about some of the processes of doing results chains, learning reviews, things like that. So what I know is that in terms of developing and applying those types of tools and practices, I look to this community as one of the sources of leadership for bringing others in. And what I think Francesca was talking about in terms of being a translator, being bilingual. And I think that that's something to really build upon in the collaborative spaces like we're talking about.
James, do you want to take that on? How is biodiversity and natural resource management, how does that relate to collaboration?
Sure. I think, again, relating back to the trip I took early on, which sort of opened my eyes to the connections. And there's a book called Change by Design, which promotes nonlinear thinking and approaches to problems and looking at relationships and connections. And I think that trip helped me see that. Our Food to Future program at the time also was pretty complex, and from my perspective, I felt it was trying to address as many issues that kept rural families poor as it could, as opposed to just trying to raise on-farm incomes. It was also about improving conditions in the household so children are healthier, had links to food programs at schools, et cetera. So with the biodiversity piece, I felt like our partner was interacting with several different actors who had some relevance to success as it related to our biodiversity objectives. And those actors turned out to be, the mayors, turned out to be, again, mid-size and larger private sector. Actors turned out to be small coffee farmers, turned out to be programs focused on schools and youth to some degree. So that, again, that program had links to several different sectors and that we were already working in. So again, taking that example, how do we work the other way and begin to get our sectors linked differently based on that model was how it sort of evolved in part in Honduras.
So Josh, let me turn to you for the last word on this, especially in terms of your work collaborating with other organizations. What do you find specifically relevant coming out of the natural resource management biodiversity realm about collaboration? Why is it particularly valuable for those sectors?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I'll very much build on Lane and James's comments. And I think for me, what is sort of important to think about in the sort of biodiversity and natural resource management context is that we're still in a period where many of the values that that nature can provide to people still aren't well specified in the evidence base. There's knowledge gaps or things that are emerging that need to be made clearer and stronger about those linkages. And I want to sort of actually shift back to the first webinar in this series a couple of weeks ago, which had 3 fantastic examples of these types of connections. And that sometimes what's limiting the ability of the sort of natural resource sector to partner with others is lack of clarity on where those connections are and where there's the strongest evidence to move forward. And so there was, for example, one talk by Tyler Ricci from the Gund Institute at University of Vermont, which part of it talked about the link between the health of upstream forests and actually getting better downstream clean water, sanitation, and health outcomes. And I think the more that collaboration can be a vehicle to help surface questions that need to be answered together and then become a mechanism for sort of effective evidence delivery about those linkages, we can take these values that are sort of hidden on the nature side and make them explicit and actionable. I think that's really an important sort of driver for collaboration, and something that is a bit unique, that the natural resource sector can deal in some different metrics and different issues, but through this we can really make really strong, clear linkages to why conservation and development really have a shared interest and a shared need to work together going forward for better outcomes.
Let me just, we'll end here, but I wanted to just bring up one topic that couple other questioners had, which is we're living in a very unusual age right now. We have conflicts, crises, threats that are unique. And Francesca mentioned the example of the Thailand caves and people coming together and working. First of all, I will say that oftentimes conflict and risk do bring together working together. I think you see that in AID, you see that in other donors too. But you also sometimes see people saying, I know that's important, but not now. I know you think that's important, but biodiversity can wait. We have to save people's lives now. And one of the questions that we're not covering right now is this issue of how do you get people to listen to these issues when in fact they don't have time to listen to these issues because they're focusing on something else? And so I thought that's a really interesting question. I think we should all take that into mind in other discussions outside of this conversation. Thank you all 200 and something of you that have listened to this. We really appreciated having you online. If you have any follow-up questions to any of the panelists, please contact us through Wilson Center or E3 people. And let me know if there's any other follow-up that you have. Any other final comments, questions from our panelists? Josh, do you have a sentence or two?
Just a huge thanks for the chance to join, and would just I love the ending question comment, and would double down on the reality that organizations, some are shifting back further into their silos now, some are really leaning into collaboration as a way to solve these challenges. And I think the comments today have really emphasized how important it is for us not to retreat back and assume that we can solve problems by ourselves. A sustainable future that's good for nature and people really requires us to wrestle with these tough challenges. And Francesca's comments and all the comments today really emphasize that we have skills and we know increasingly how to do this. It's, I think, the will and the commitment to sustaining it to move us forward. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you. James, do you want to have a final word here?
Sure. I just to say that in my current role as a development diplomat in residence, I speak to a lot of young people, a lot of students who think they might want a career in development and maybe in Usaid. And one of the things I emphasize is not only do we get to work on issues that are bigger than us individually, which is one of the things I value the most about this job, but I firmly believe no one accomplishes anything on their own in Usaid. And as someone who values teams, that's a great place,
Exactly.
Great part of our culture. And that's voucher examiners, human resource specialists, everyone is contributing to our success, and that's, I think, speaks to the issue of collaboration as well. That culturally, it's built into how we function as an agency. And so, thank you to everybody. I've learned a lot, and it's been a great opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, as always, James. Lane, the last word.
Very quickly, joining all the thanks and appreciations, I also learned a lot. I was completely fascinated by what others were saying in this conversation. I think the reflection I would just end on is also related to the current pandemic and the current situation. In our warm-up conversation this morning as panelists, we were talking about what might be the lasting change, what could we learn, what's shifted in terms of how we work together. And there are things that are good or better or more enhancing in terms of how we collaborate in the current context. But I hope that among other changes that might last, it's, I think as a couple of people have said, it's the getting to we. As James was just saying, we're such an interdependent system, and the international development efforts that we advance are absolutely interrelated in so many ways that I hope that one of the hangovers from the current situation is to develop some more trust, develop some more collaborative practices that can really make our development efforts more efficient and effective. So, but thank you, and thank you, Tony, in particular, for your moderation.
Thank you. And by the way, it really would be a shame if this conversation doesn't continue, because I think this is the type of conversation our community needs more of. And I do think the point about people bringing back and saying, I'm sorry, I know your subject is important, but I don't have time now, is really at front and center right this second. So I think this type of conversation is important to continue, and I look forward to hearing how our colleagues from E3 would like to see that happen over the next several months or years. Again, thank you very much. I think at this point at 10:59 we will end. Thank you again, and have a nice day or evening or morning. Bye-bye.
Stay healthy, everybody.
Absolutely.